I think I started off onto the requirement elicitation. I explained what are the inputs which come in here, and then start there. Is that where we start? Just help me try to recollect it. Okay. So let's start the session. So make sure that you have the the high-level scope document, usually the statement of work or the business case document, so that you have a point of reference. You can figure out these are these 10, 20 or 15 requirements that will have to capture into detailed requirements, and you clearly know the key people who are your SMEs, would give you the requirements and who would approve it, right? You have all those templates as well, like traceability, the tool that you're going to use for elicitation, and all those would come in as inputs. And then you would start on to the requirement elicitation process. There is no tangible deliverable coming out of it because it's tightly coupled to the requirements documentation chapter, which is the next one, right? We'll cover how to document the requirements as part of the next phase, next chapter, right? So chapter 4 would primarily deal with how to document our requirements, and chapter 3, the one what we are talking about now, would cover about how to understand the requirements. Okay. Now, broadly, there are 10 ways in which you would engage a customer to understand the requirements. Okay. So you'll start with document analysis, interviews, observations, right? Then you have prototyping, and then you have group techniques like focus group, brainstorming, workshops. You do reverse engineering, you do interface analysis, you do the surveys and questionnaires, right? So these are the 10 ways. So the next 2-3 sessions would focus on how on understanding these various techniques and how to engage the SMEs in these techniques to understand the requirements in detail. Okay. Now, yeah. So let's spend some time on understanding where do we start our requirements, right? So what's the first thing that you should do when you get into your requirements, right? Are we going to say, you'll go to the SME and then say, okay, start explaining about the requirement, first requirement, right? Or where exactly are you going to start, right? Let's take this, same example what we generally take, the mobile banking app. Now, where do you start? Are you going to directly, go and then say, okay, ask the SME, tell me each and every detailed requirement and then I'll document it? Not really. You're not going to be dependent on the SME completely for your requirements, right? Now, the first step I would strongly recommend is read some documents. Okay. Now, there is enough information which you can gather, by reading some documents, right? A lot of this information is even available on the public websites. Like, if I just Google for mobile banking, right? I could get what all functionality does it offer, right? I can get that high level information about mobile banking and what all it does by just reading through Google, right? Now there are enough documents available within the organization and outside in the on the internet, right, which you can refer to get that base understanding of the requirements, right? So why do we need to do that? Because it helps us to get that basic minimum knowledge. So you don't want to be like you don't want to be in a situation wherein you go to the SME and then say, I don't know anything, start telling me the requirements now, right? It will portray you in a very bad shape, right? So nobody wants to deal with a person who absolutely has nothing, no knowledge, and he's dependent on you completely for your requirements, right? So it always makes sense to go prepared for these interviews or your discussions with SMEs, right? And reading through these documents is the first step towards that, right? So you know there are a lot of documents within your organization and outside on the internet which you can figure out to understand the requirement. The first level of detail. I'm not saying the complete requirement is available on the internet, but you know the first level of detail you can definitely get it from there, right? So refer to those documents. Make sure that you know you understand those. You search for those documents and get those high level details, and then read through those documents to get that first level of understanding. Some documents which would help you, the first set of documents which you definitely read is the SOW, maybe your RFP response if there was a competitive bidding, a business case if there was a business case document which was prepared. So these are some of the documents which you definitely read. Okay, then you know some of the documents are very contextual, like you know if there is an existing process within an organization, right? Like you know maybe some guidelines regarding a credit analysis, right? So there would be some you know standard operating procedure within the organization. This is step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you have to do, right? So there would be standard operating procedures, you know, guidelines, then the procedure documents, the manuals which you can read, which are available within the organization to understand that specific process, right? So wherever the projects are that kind where they are mostly internal, you want to understand the internal process, ask for these process documents. Okay, so you can always ask for those documents and get that first level of understanding, rather than completely depending on the you know SME for the detailed requirement, right? So for some of the projects, it could be like you know you could get it from your competitors, right? Like you know a mobile banking application is a good one, right? So you can figure out you know what each one of those banks are doing, right? So you have so many mobile banking applications available. You can check out their websites, figure out what all functionalities are available in their in the competitors products, or you could look out for analyst reports and then see what all they are offering, right? So you get that basic understanding about that features, the first level of details, by reading some documents, by checking out your competitor reviews, or you know figuring it out on the internet, right? There are multiple sources. You don't have to depend completely on the SME for explaining you the detailed requirements, right? Now this document analysis or reading through some documents would help you get that first level of knowledge. So this is not going to give you the detailed requirement. It gets to a stage where you can start conversing with the SME. You'll get that minimum basic knowledge which is required on that particular domain topic of the project. Okay, so there could be some topics like you know maybe the example what I was taking about was about a you know a fraud and anti-fraud system, right? Now for banks, right? Now there are so many you know details documents available on the internet. You can read through and then figure out you know what kind of you know fraud prevention, what kind of solutions, what kind of features they offer, right? So step 1, read stuff. Okay, so there are enough information on the internet, there are enough information within the organization, across your competitors, across the regulators. A lot of systems would have to you know generate some reports or some you know documents for the regulatory requirements, right? So they are available on the regulatory websites. Like banks, you know, you always have this Fed which will ask for some kind of reports, right? So you can figure out all those regulatory requirements, figure out who are the sources, and then check their websites for what kind of requirements or what kind of reports they would ask for this particular requirement, and cover that. Okay. Sorry. So that's the first step you would do. You would read some documents and understand that first level of knowledge. Then what? Right? So you gain that basic understanding. You fairly have an understanding, a broad picture that you know this is what is this requirement about. but you still don't really have the specifics. How exactly the screen should look like, what details we should capture, what is mandatory, what is optional, what should be the alternate flows, right? A lot of details are missing out in this process, right? Now, those level of details you will go for your interviews, right? So interview is nothing but a one-on-one discussion with your subject matter experts. So you're having those discussions, you're asking questions, the SMEs are responding, and you're noting down those responses, right? So that's exactly is what you do in an interview. Interviews again are broadly of two types. One is structured and the second one is unstructured interviews. Unstructured interview means you're generally going unprepared for the interview. So you don't have the list of questions that you want to ask. Okay. Now generally you do that maybe in the first 1-2 sessions to understand what is in scope, and the high level details. Right. Otherwise, most of your interviews should be structured interviews, which means once you have the requirement, you should clearly list down the list of questions. Right? You first gain that high level knowledge by reading some documents and going through the internet or some space, figuring it out what is the process about, and then prepare the list of questions that you want to ask to gain that specific knowledge, right? So I'll help you with one framework which will help you, document all those kind of questions, how to arrive at what kind of questions to ask, right? And how to be pretty much sure that you are clear with the requirement, right? So let's spend some time towards that, and then we'll see, right? Yeah, but before that, you guys clearly understand the document analysis, what kind of documents are available, in what context, and what level of detail we get through the document analysis. So is that process clear? Right? It's quite simple. There's nothing too complicated in it. You figure out for some documents and read through that. Right? So that's all what you're doing. Okay? So that's the first step. You read through some documents which are available and gain that first level of knowledge. Right? So you're not completely going to depend on the SME. You read some documents on your own and capture these details. Okay? So post that, what you would do is you would right. So you would spend some time with the SMEs, asking them questions and then capturing their responses. Right? Most of the time you go prepared for your interviews. Right? So I'll give you a broad framework on which you should list down what kind of questions to ask. Right? So one is basically the flow. Right? So you need to clearly identify what is the sequence of steps. Right? So figure out the process flow. Right? What is the step-by-step process to do this? So that's the first thing that you would capture. Okay. Now, if you take up any requirement, like let's say your mobile banking application, you want to do a funds transfer. So what is the step-by-step process? So that's your primary flow or the process flow in which you would do. Right? So this is something which you should clearly try to understand as part of your interview, right? And as part of this flow, you need to figure out, what is the sequence of steps that you need to perform, and what if the user misses out of any or enters an incorrect detail or selects a wrong option. So what kind of error messages you should display. So all those details also should be captured, right? So broadly, you're helping the user of the system list down the sequence of steps that he has to perform, and in case something is incorrectly entered, then what is the error message that you have to display. Right? So that's what you're doing. You're trying to understand. Right? So focus on that particular process flow for that requirement. Like example, if you have a funds transfer, right? So what is the first step that you would do, right? And then the next step that you would do, what kind of information that you would capture, or what if some information is not available, then what kind of error messages you should display. If some validations fail, what kind of error messages you should display. So list down those questions, right? So understand the process flow for each of those deviations. Figure out what are all the alternate flows, right? And then also check, are there any prerequisites or preconditions before you can right. So you'll focus on the the flow, the primary flows, and then the alternate flows. You'll focus on the prerequisites or some conditions that should be satisfied before you get into a requirement. For example, before you could do a funds transfer, maybe you should log in into the system. You should have some funds in your account. So these are some of the five before you can even start that requirement, right? So figure out those prerequisites, right? So figure out those follow-up activities, like some maybe notifications, right? And then emails that you want to generate, right? Or some reporting that you want to do, right? All follow-up activities that you should do after your functionality is over. So maybe like if you take the funds transfer example, right? Maybe you should send out an SMS to the customer just to make sure that somebody has not exploited his mobile phone or something. You send out an SMS. You could also create an audit log. You could send out an email. So there are a lot of things that you want to do. You'll have to check with the customer what kind of notifications, reporting, audit logs that you'll have to prepare. Right? So that's another set of information that you could ask. Right? So what happens if the system breaks down? Let's say you're transferring some funds, and then there is the application crashed. So what should you do? Right? So capture those exceptions as well. Right? So these are some of those indications which will help you to frame your questions, right? So check on those process flows, check on those entry criteria, prerequisites or preconditions, check out for those notifications, right? Check out for those exceptions when something breaks down, right? Or something is not functioning correctly, like there is an you're transferring funds and then suddenly the internet is off, or maybe the application crashed. So how would you continue from there, right? All those exceptions have to be clearly captured. So broad guidelines to ask those kind of questions, right? So what kind of questions you should think about each process, and then you could look at each one of them and then capture these details. Right? So these are some indications on what kind of questions to ask. So this way you are leading the requirements. So you're not completely dependent on the SME to tell you the comprehensive requirements, right? So if you figure out these 5 things, that these are the 5 things that I'll ensure that I'll ask, you can be pretty much sure that your requirement is comprehensive. Okay, I'll take a very small example and then let's go through this process, right? Now everybody understands this functionality about login, right? So you have a screen, you have a user ID, you would have to enter password, and then you click on submit. There'll be maybe a reset button as well, right? So user ID, password, right? So you might think that this is a very simple example, right? So we don't even need to capture the detailed requirements or have a discussion with the customer to understand the requirements for this, right? But even the SME would feel like that, right? So what is there in this login functionality? It's a very simple one. You enter user ID, password, and then you log in into the system, right? But let's go through this framework, right? And then see, have we collected all those information, or what kind of questions you could ask, right? So the primary flow, you will enter the user ID, password, and then click on submit. You would complete the set. I think more or less we can ask this question: what are the series of steps that you want to perform, for this login functionality, right? So you'll get that primary flow. First question will be, give me the list of steps or the process flow for this particular requirement logging into, right? Then you'll figure out the alternative requirements, right? So let's call this as 2, 3, 4, right? So alternative flows would be, now what if the user enters an incorrect user ID, right? So this is an alternate flow. Maybe you'll have to display a message saying that your user ID is incorrect, please check it. Or what if the user ID and if the user enters an incorrect password, right? So this is the second question on alternate flows, right? So should you ask the user? You should ask the user, what if the password is incorrect? What should you do, right? So you should display a message that saying that your password is incorrect, please try again, right? So do you want to bring in a security mechanism that after 3 unsuccessful logins you want to block the user ID, right? So unless you ask these questions, those requirements would not come out, right? Or what happens if you forget your password? How would you retrieve it, right? So even before getting into the requirements, I'm having these questions. Why? Because I can actually at a high level think through the process and then figure out what kind of questions. So broadly look at this framework. Focus on your primary flow, your alternate flow, right? Alternate flow, you can figure out each step. What if something is missing? What should we do? So this will help out to capture the requirement. Just give me a minute. I need to get my power card. So you'll figure out about your alternate flows. All right. Then you'll ask questions regarding are there any prerequisites or something which should have been completed before we even start this requirement, right? So before even logging in, should you do something? Should you check out whether something is already there? Maybe he should register first, right? He should be an active user. He should not have been blocked, or his user ID should not have been blocked because his password is compromised or something like that, right? So that I need to perform these checks before I log in, right? So you're getting those preconditions. Then you also figure out is there any notifications or anything that I have to mention, right? So maybe you have to do your audit log that this user logged in at this particular time, right? No report needs to be generated, nothing for this requirement, but update your audit log. Okay. Then what if your system is down, right? So maybe the network is down and you're not able to contact your server, authentication server. So you have to display that you're not able to log in into your system. So please try again after some time, something like that. So your exception flows, you're figuring it out, right? A broad framework which will help out list down those questions, right? So we also this is also called as a use case narrative. When we get into the use case requirement, we'll understand this in much more detail. But it gives you an excellent framework to ask those right kind of questions, right? So whenever you go for those one-on-one discussions, broadly have this at the back of your mind. First, try to understand the process flow. Then figure out, what if some deviations happen, if the user enters the incorrect information or selects a different option. So for each of those steps, you have to evaluate and then see, can something go wrong at this step? In that situation, how should the system respond, right? So each of those would result into a question, and then you capture the details. Then you will figure out, are there any prerequisites before you start this requirement, right? Like, you should be a registered user, you should be an active user, and all that stuff would come out, right? Then any notifications or anything that you want to do after you log in into the system, right? Or maybe an unsuccessful attempt has been made, right? So maybe you should update your audit logs. So that's the only thing that you want to say here, right? And finally, your exception flows. When something goes wrong, what should you do, right? So that comes out as your exception flows. Okay. So use this framework to prepare for those questions, right? So a typical, time I would suggest, if you are planning for like half an hour or 1 hour interview session, make sure that you spend at least that half an hour, 1 hour slot to prepare your questions before you even go and meet the customer, right? So upfront you should have these kind of questions listed here, and you should you should capture the responses for all that. Okay, any questions, guys? Is it clear? Hello.
So these questions would be asked to whom?
To the subject matter.
To the customer.
Yes, the customer, right? So they will see. Don't expect that the subject matter experts know what all requirements would the system need, and he would tell you everything, right?
Right.
If you ask, he will tell you. He will know that, but he will not tell that comprehensively himself, right? So this framework would help you ask those right questions, right? So what all things you need to ask, and then what all details you need to get. So these 5 set of details would help you out. Okay. Now this is also called as a use case framework. We'll cover this detail when we're talking about the documentation, because we'll go back and then document this as part of our requirements specification, right? So use this framework for asking those questions and then getting those details. So if you are clear that you have all these details, then you can be pretty much sure that I have enough details to go and capture my requirements. Okay. So that's the approach you should take. So always keep this at the back of your mind, so this will give you a framework of what kind of questions I should ask, right? It gives you a structure to your requirements document, the way you're asking those questions, right? So mostly your structured interview, you'll have to go prepared for your questions, and broadly, focus on this framework for asking those right kind of questions, right? So these two are very frequent techniques, right? So almost every project you'll figure out what documents to read through, and then you read through them to understand that gain that first level of knowledge. Then you would have those one-on-one discussions with the subject matter experts. You ask them questions, capture those responses, right? So this is also a very, very common technique. In almost all the projects will use these two techniques, right? We tend to use observation technique also wherever there is an existing process or system is in place. Why? Because it's always easier to see and then understand something rather than listen and understand, right? So you must have heard a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So the same applies for here as well. So rather than asking the SME and then he would explain this process flow, you could always ask him, can you please demonstrate it to me? Can you please show me how you do it currently? Right? A simple step. He would actually do that for you, and then you could just watch him and then see how is he capturing the details. Okay, just give me a minute. Yeah. So observation technique is nothing but asking him to demonstrate how he currently does it, and then taking notes of it. You're trying to understand it by watching how the person does. Now obviously this can be done when there is an existing process in place. Something like, let's say there is a process for customer registration. So you could say, how are you registering your customers now? It could be done manually, that there is a manual paper-based form that he would have to be filling in. Then he will perform some validations. You could watch that, or there could be some old mainframe-based system which you want to modify and then make it look better and do more efficiently. So you would use those observation technique to understand the process, right? Now this technique would not work if there is no existing process in place. For example, your mobile banking application. It's a completely new system, right? So there won't be any existing process. There is no existing funds transfer in a mobile app, right? So obviously, it might not work, right? So maybe you can use your online banking to understand the functionality and then convert into mobile. But directly there is no mapping, that there is no functionality there, right? So you could come across some features which are new or first of its kind. There is no existing process. In those kind of situations, an observation technique would not work, right? So that's one main thing that you'll have to be aware. If it's a completely new thing, maybe the observation technique might not work. The other word of caution, if you just focus on the most popular way or the most common way of how things are done. Like, let's say there is a customer registration form, right? And as part of that, you will capture some n number of details. Let's say there are some 20 data points that you are capturing and some 5 documents that you are capturing, right? Now, most of the time when the customer is demonstrating, he will enter values which are everything is right, or he will submit the documents where everything is right, right? So you tend to only get this primary flow when you are going for your demonstrations, right? So he might skip out of all these alternate flows. So maybe what if one of these documents is not valid, if it's a fake document, or it's a forged document. So what should be the process flow, right? So unless you ask those questions, maybe the SME might not demonstrate it, right? So make sure that you ask those right questions, right, along with your observation. Even the customer is demonstrating it, you should ask those questions and then check out those options. How should the system respond in case there is a deviation in the process, right? So those alternate flows are not coming out glaringly in your observation techniques or your demonstrations, right? So you need to be careful to ask those questions and ensure that you get those details as well when you're doing observation techniques. So these are the 2 key things that you need to be aware of, right? Observation technique would not work where there is no existing process, and it would generally tend to focus on the most popular flows. And it's your responsibility to ask those questions and get those additional details when you are using an observation technique, right? So broadly, there are 2 types of observation: active and passive. Active means the SME is dedicatedly demonstrating the product, the functionality to you, right? So he's only explaining the functionality just for you, right? So there is no other need for him to do that process. Just that you could understand the process. He's actually doing that process activity and then explaining it in detail to you, right? In some scenarios where you want to make it more efficient, maybe you just want to observe him from a distance and do not disturb him, right? So you want to see how he is doing currently, where exactly you find problems with the process, or you try to figure out what exactly are the limitations of the system. You could go in for a passive observation. A passive observation means that you are not asking the SME to explain the process to you, right? He is doing his job and then you are observing him from a distance. You are not even disturbing him with the questions at that point. Now, why do we need to do that? There are 2 main reasons. One, in some cases, maybe the SME could be really tied up with his operational work. Now, most of your SMEs are not there dedicatedly to help you with their requirements. So they do their day jobs also, right? So they do their operations job, and they take this additional responsibility for these requirements. Does somebody have a question? No. Okay. So in those kind of situations, what you could do is, you could say, you do your job, let me watch you for some time, so that will give me first level of knowledge, and then we can have a discussion, small discussion, to close out on my questions. So that way we'll save our time. We don't have to spend the whole 1-2 hours. Maybe 15-20 minutes we could close out on all questions, and then so this way you're saving both their time, right? But this rarely happens. Whenever somebody is actually assigned to a project, they are dedicatedly given. So rarely you would get into these kind of situations. But in case where the SME is hard pressed for time, you could always use this option. You could go for a passive observation, and then ask him to continue with his job, and then you would watch him and understand the requirement. Right? Now, the second reason where you could go for a passive observation is you want to understand where exactly is the customer getting stuck. Right? If they, if you want to figure out, is there any point where this guy is getting into unnecessary activities, or can I improve this process? So you want to figure out that behavior of that person using the system, right? From a usability point of view, you tend to go for these passive observations, right? You will figure out, some of the information might not be very clearly coming out on your screens. So the customers might be, the SME might be looking at that and then thinking through, or you might spend a lot more time on that, filling in some data, right? You could take those inputs and then try to optimize it. You can make it look much more efficient and faster by using those inputs, right? So use observation technique judiciously, right? So wherever possible you should go for the observation technique, right? So if the customer could actually help you out by demonstrating something, ask for it, because that way you understand the requirement much better than just listening to the person's requirement, right? It will reduce the disconnect also. So if you are watching something, it's easier for you to understand, and compared to just somebody explaining you could interpret it in a completely different way. To reduce all those disconnects, go for an observation technique wherever possible, right? Now broadly, these three techniques would give you enough information about the requirement, right? Most of the times we tend to use these techniques. These three techniques are most widely used, right? You first read some documents, get that basic understanding, then you go prepared with the list of questions. You understand those requirements by asking those questions, and then capture the details. Then wherever possible, you will ask the customer to demonstrate that particular requirement, and then capture the details, right? You would understand the requirements in that way, right? Most frequently used techniques are these three. Okay.